This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Welcome to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. My name is Sam, and I'm your host, and I'm joined by a voracious reader, Richard Blackaby.
Yeah, not a vicious reader,
No.
Voracious.
Yeah, voracious.
Yeah.
We've got a stack of books here. If you could see what I'm seeing, it's
Don't
maybe
sneeze, Sam. You could bring the whole thing tumbling down on me.
Yeah, altogether, this is probably it's maybe 3.5, 4 feet of books stacked on top of each other precariously. So we're doing we've talked a lot about reading here on the podcast before, and we do periodic book reviews, primarily in the area of leadership, but we've been known to wander. And so what we thought we'd do today is, Richard, you are a very well-read individual, I guess I would say, and you do a lot of reading each year, and I thought it might be kind of neat to just kind of look behind the curtain and see what are some standout books of 2021 that you've read that you would recommend, and why you'd recommend them, who you think should read them, maybe a little bit about each book, and then also we've got a stack of books that you've kind of got on the docket, the to-read list, or started reading, haven't finished yet. And so we just kind of go through this list and tell us a little bit about each book. Some of these we've done whole podcasts on before, so they may be familiar to some of our listeners, but we just thought we'd kind of do a rapid fire of great books that you would recommend as we are still in the early days of 2022.
Sure. This is kind of a different one. I wish that this probably could be video and I could kind of show these books, but we'll have links to them. And to be honest with you, just full disclosure, this is probably a lighter read year for me because it was a really heavy writing year for me. And when I'm doing a lot of writing every evening that I might have spent some time reading, I'm sitting there cranking stuff out of my laptop instead.
Right.
So in some ways, this is probably a lighter year, but
so it sounds like you're just trying to make excuses for
basically
your lack of reading.
But let me still give you kind of a glimpse, at least, of some of the variety that I was a part of. Maybe I could begin and just say, like I read earlier this year, Beyond Order by Jordan Peterson, and we did a podcast just on one of his rules for life. But Jordan Peterson did an earlier book I read last year on the 12 Rules for Life, and now this one is a sequel. But Peterson, of course, is a therapist. He's deep into psychology and archetypes and brainiac kind of person. And I wouldn't call him an evangelical Christian. He's still, I think, searching for what God means to him. He has a lot of psychology and evolution and philosophy all tangled up in there that he's trying to sort out. But he does have a lot of practical, psychological approaches to life. A lot of times you realize he's coming at it from maybe a psychological background, but it sure lines up with a lot of what the Bible says. Yeah. And so that was interesting. He's a pretty smart person, and so you kind of have to read him a little bit slowly, but he tells lots of stories that kind of puts handles on it, and he digs into Greek mythology and Egyptian mythology and so on, Persian, and so he can go all over the place. He's got a pretty broad width, and
I wouldn't think that's necessarily what I'd call light reading.
No, it's not.
And it's a pretty big book too.
And I think it's over 400 pages, and there's another book that's a very different kind of read, but it's similar in a sense in the focus. And it's a book by David Benner called The Gift of Being Yourself. And we actually did a podcast on this book as well. But it takes, again, kind of an interesting approach. It's not nearly as big of a read. But essentially, he says you need to know yourself, and not the false view of yourself, not the self that you try to project to others, but truly know yourself. And that sounds fairly simplistic, and yet, well, I tell you, there's a lot of folks that really struggle to know who they are, and they have a kind of a view of themselves of who they wish that they were, that they try to project on others, but it's not necessarily their true self. But he says some things that I think are interesting in that regard, because he is coming from a Christian perspective, and he says things like, because we would tend to think, well, what really matters is God, and what God wants to do in your life, and you shouldn't be self-focused. You should be God-focused, which is all true. But his point is, it's hard to be surrendered to God until you know what you're surrendering. Or, you can say that you give all that you are to God, but do you even know what that is? Do you know what you're giving? And so he would, in many ways, he would come back to say, you can't be, if you're going to be intimately involved in knowing God, you have to know yourself as well. And so goes a little bit against me what you'd think. You'd think, well, the key is God. It's all God. But he makes an interesting case for the fact that to truly know God, you have to know yourself also. And so kind of interesting read. I like kind of reading people that, they don't take a long time in some of these books. Like what I find is with some books, they basically have one major point that they're making. And I know people that stretch one point into 400 pages. And I've actually tried to shift a bit more to some of that kind of writing myself, where instead of trying to do this comprehensive cover the waterfront, you just kind of read, you write very specifically to make a primary point and illustrate it, back it up, and kind of leave it there. And those are the kind of books that people tend to be reading more of anyway. So maybe going back, and you've read this one too, but there's another book we read in our book club by Trueman called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. And that is a tome.
Yeah,
that's deep.
Certainly not light reading.
No, that might have been one of the toughest books, I think, that we read this year.
Yeah, probably read that one with a dictionary.
I actually did some searches on Google, because he's mentioning different philosophical approaches in schools and ethical schools that I was not really familiar with. And he has a couple of ethicists that he draws heavily upon, and I don't know if I'd heard of any of them, but he does make a very interesting case. And I mean, again, this is not for the faint of heart, but it is a very exhaustive case. Basically, when he says in his beginning, he'll say something like, if he reads a statement now and a man says, I am a woman in a man's body, trapped in a man's body, then Trueman says, not only how did society get to the place where someone could say that, but even more so, how did we get to the place in society where someone could say that and we weren't shocked by it, we basically understood what he was saying,
right,
and accepted that as true. And he says, because that's not the way that, if someone had said that 100 years ago, he might have been locked up in an insane asylum somewhere. But now things have changed, and so he, in one sense, he's not necessarily trying to judge that. He's just saying, but how did we get to where that kind of statement is now commonplace? And so he looks at philosophers and poets and the people that had an influence on culture, and says, he traces and shows you step by step. Yeah,
that this didn't just come out of the 60s and 70s,
right,
and the hippie movement or anything like that. Like, this goes way back.
Yeah, and it does kind of alert you as well that even something as innocuous as like a poet, you think, well, how could a poet have any impact on my life and my culture today? But he makes pretty strong cases to show where when things get said enough times, they start to leave an impression. And so interesting kind of academic book. It's the kind of book that you'd read in a PhD seminar. I mean, it's a high-level book. But again, it's kind of he's a Christian, and he's trying to just help us understand not necessarily to accept it or agree with it, but just to see the progression,
how we got to where we are in today's culture.
So interesting read, but again, you got to be a serious
Take some
reader
diligence to read that one. Yeah,
work your way through, and maybe one more on that sort of framework, and that's actually by someone that used to be a professor for me. His name is Dwayne Garrett. He's the head of the Old Testament department at Southern Seminary now, but he wrote an interesting book called The Problem of the Old Testament, and I found that very interesting. I'd read a book earlier that basically tried to say that the Old Testament was no longer relevant to modern Christians, that the Old Testament was basically written for the Jews, for the nation of Israel, and that now we just needed the New Testament. We're New Testament Christians, not Old Testament Christians. And a lot of very prominent Christian leaders and pastors hold to that view. And so I really enjoyed reading Garrett. And of course, again, it's he's a scholar, he's a bright person, but he's trying to say, there's also danger sometimes when you read the Old Testament and you just accept everything without any understanding of its context, who God's writing to, what was the purpose of this prophetic book, and so on. And I think for most of us as Christians, we probably would say we get into some pretty thin water or ice at times when it comes to understanding some of the Old Testament and what was this about. Mm. And there are times where you read things that God is saying and you think, wow, that really sounds nothing like Jesus, And of course, there have been those who said that in one way or another, they basically argued that there was an Old Testament God and a New Testament God, and Jesus represented the New Testament God and this angry, vengeful, wrathful Old Testament God that destroyed cities and told Israelites to wipe every living creature off the planet, is somehow a different God. And so this is a very interesting read, The Problem of the Old Testament, where Garrett, I feel for the most part, there's one or two places I might push back a bit on, but I'm certainly not the Hebrew scholar that he is, or the Bible student he is. And for the most part, he tends to not kind of shy away from the difficult passages. And he tries not to also just give easy answers, but to wrestle with the text and try to stay true to what it means. And so,
I think for so many people, the Old Testament is kind of a big question mark, or kind of a scary place to go and try and make sense of it. So I think something like that could be very helpful, and at least putting into context, what is the Old Testament and what relevance does it have for today's Christian?
Yeah, I very much so. And so a couple other books I read. I read a couple biographies, not as many as I would have liked to this year. Again,
because you read anything other than a biography, that's not enough.
Yeah, there's so two that I read. One is by Iain Murray, called The Life of Martyn Lloyd-Jones. And if you're not familiar with Jones, he lived from 1899 to 1981, was a pastor of a church in London, and he was a Calvinist. He was a pastor that preached scripture and just basically felt like if you would just faithfully teach God's word and help people to apply it to their life, that God will use that powerfully. And there were a lot of folks that were deeply impacted by his ministry over the years. People like J.I. Packer were deeply influenced by him when he was a young man, and a lot of the who's who of influential evangelicals later were deeply impacted by him. But just an interesting read. There's a lot of kind of biblical insights along the way that I found quite interesting. And if you're a pastor, and I think there is more to pastoring than just simply preaching biblical sermons and teaching, but watch a person that had a deep sense of integrity about his life. I'm going to write on my blog site. I'm going to do a book review about this as soon as I have some time. And there's another book, and we did do a podcast on this one, so I won't take as much time, but it's an autobiography by John G. Patton, missionary to the New Hebrides. And of course, when he went there in about 1858, it was inhabited by cannibals, and he leaves Scotland and goes to a very forsaken place, very ravaged by disease and malaria and other things. His new bride is giving birth to their first child, and both she and the baby die. All kinds of people, missionaries die. He's about the only missionary left alive when he finally leaves about 5 years later. And he's basically surrounded by cannibals all wanting to kill him and eat him. And he just realizes his position at that time is untenable to stay there. And so he doesn't go back home. He basically moves to a different island, and eventually that island is completely converted pretty well to Christianity. And ultimately people come back and build on the foundation where he built on his first island, and a strong work ultimately develops there as well. But I'll tell you, this is actually a book that was out of print, and there is a publisher that comes back and takes some books that they see has some real message and merit, and they republish them. It's actually called Forgotten Books, I think is maybe the name of their publishing company. But again, it really challenged me. You just need to get around people sometimes that are obvious. I mean, they're not perfect. They've got their own struggles, their own humanity that they have to overcome. Some things that they probably would do over if they could, but you find people that took their walk with God very seriously, and they take the gospel very seriously. People's need to hear it, and so powerful book. I kind of just was reminded, because I read a lot of biographies of generals and emperors and kings and other people,
political leaders,
business leaders, but sometimes just reading these two biographies, both run very strong Christian leaders, and I enjoyed that. I enjoyed just putting my life next to theirs and hoping that some things rubbed off on me. And one other one, not a biography, but a different kind of book as well, was by Andrew Murray. Andrew Murray, of course, was a pastor in South Africa, pastored several churches there throughout the course of his career, wrote many, many books. And I would say, if you see an Andrew Murray book, you just need to buy it and read it. He is pretty easy to follow. He just speaks on the Christian life in a really engaging way. But this book, probably one of his best known, was called With Christ in the School of Prayer, and he has several books on prayer, but this one is maybe one of his best, and just basically unpacks what prayer is, and almost as if this great Christian leader were trying to tell you, okay, just walk with me, and I'm going to teach you what it means to pray. And he has some great insights. You wonder sometimes when you read an older book like this, you kind of think in one sense, okay, these guys who were discovering stuff and saying it for the first time back in like the 1800s, well, that stuff should all be well known now. It's like if you read a book on prayer now in the 21st century, when you read a guy like Murray, you should just say, oh yeah, well, everybody knows that. That's been around for ages. But somehow a lot of these insights get passed over or missed or forgotten, or somehow they had their day, and you kind of move on with some new insight. And so you go back and read these books that are 150 years old, and it's like, wow, like where did this guy come up with this stuff? And it's actually been out a long time. It's just that the modern books don't highlight a lot of it. And so it's kind of like when musicians discover old hymns and put a new tune to it, and it's like, you think it's just the best thing out there, and you realize that it was originally written hundreds of years ago.
Right.
And so, you know what? When it comes to prayer, I think we make a mistake when we think that we just know basically all that we need to know about that. There's just a whole lot. I think if there was one skill or exercise that Christians ought to regularly hone up on and try to keep sharp in, it would be in their prayer life. And so not a bad thing just every year to read at least one book on prayer, but that is probably one of the best out there if you just want to read a classic book on prayer. And so just kind of looking at some of the other ones on the list here, we did a thing as well. Two of the books that we did a podcast on, one is Gentle and Lowly by Ortland. Again, just to look at Jesus and God, basically, to say that God is not just a wrathful, judgmental, angry God, but that when Jesus basically, and Ortland says, the only time Jesus basically described his own character, he called himself gentle and lowly. And I'll tell you, in our society today, there's a lot of angry Christians, very polemical, kind of, we want to go to war against those we disagree with. Yeah. And
not a lot of gentle and lowly Christians out there, it seems.
No, it seems weak and almost as if you're caving in if you act gentle and lowly. There's something powerful, though, when the very Son of God came to earth, that he chose that route all the way to a cross. And Ortland is also very Calvinistic, and he quotes a lot from the Puritan writers. And I'll tell you what, if nothing else, I think we all need to have some exposure to the Puritans. And this is a good kind of introductory book to that. It makes you want to get books on the Puritans and read them after you read this book. Puritans had a way of just chewing the marrow and really just getting all the meat off the bone of a scripture verse. And so Puritans were famous for writing 400-page books on one psalm or something, or like one verse in a psalm almost. And so it can seem overdone, but at the same time it can also really encourage you to think, wow, there's just a whole lot more here than I was looking at.
Very meditative.
Yeah. And so we did a podcast as well on Karen Swallow Prior recently on reading well. And so I won't take much time on that, but that was another book that was good. And we did a podcast as well on my literary agent, Robert Wolgemuth, who wrote the book Gunlap. And we actually interviewed him on that book, just talking about what do you do in your life as you get to like in your 50s, 60s, you've lived quite a bit of your life. You still have lots of life to live, but how do you kind of end well? Do you end the race still sprinting all out, or are you kind of loping along or limping along or calling for a medic? And so that's kind of interesting. It's I try, like I kind of said, to spread it around, try to read books that are a challenge to me. Maybe just to mention one, two last ones. Well, I did finish one of my only fiction books all year, but it was a sizable fiction book. It was The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. It's like 1,243 pages. I was at the beach recently and just thought I'm going to take that with me, and that'll be my relax time book. And, it's quite interesting. Of course, quite a famous book. And, looking a lot at revenge, at hope when things seem hopeless, wondering why does God let people suffer. A lot of issues kind of it delves into. And, of course, it's a lot. I mean, there's times where it kind of gets into some philosophical discussions and so on, but for the most part, especially the first couple hundred pages, it just seems so tragic, and you just see the evil of people and the selfishness and how it causes suffering for others, and people living with regret, living with secrets, living with broken relationships that come back to haunt them. And so interesting read. I'll tell you what, if you ever just want to feel really proud of yourself, take on a 1,243-page book, and when you're done, you want to just kind of leave that lying around on your coffee table or something, and everyone who says, "Oh, where's that? I should have put that away after I finished reading every word of every 1,243 pages."
No, tell us. So you did read all of it then, all 1,243 pages.
Yeah, so you got to work that in somehow.
Yeah, exactly. Well, let's. I think maybe we'll take a break here. And when we come back, we'll look at some of the ones that you've got on deck and what you're excited to read coming up here. If you've ever wanted to learn how to ask better questions to help move people onto God's agenda, then we have 2 spiritual leadership coaching workshops coming up that can help you do that. One of them is going to be online only, and that's February 28th to March 2nd. And it's going to meet online from 10 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time each day. And there'll be dynamic breakout rooms in Zoom for that. And there'll be an in-person coaching workshop that's going to meet on the south side of Atlanta from May 2nd to May 4th. And both of these will be training people to ask better questions to help move people onto God's agenda. So even if you don't think you're a coach, but if you deal with people, these workshops can be very beneficial to help you become a better listener and a better communicator and help move people to where God wants them to be. We'll leave links to both of these workshops in the show notes, and you can find out more at blackabycoaching.org. And at checkout, you can use code EARLYBIRD, that's all one word, no space, at checkout for a little early bird discount in your registration. So we hope to see you at one of these 2 spiritual leadership coaching workshops. Well, Richard, it's been nice kind of looking back at some of these books from last year and what you've read, and my goodness, a 1,243-page novel. That's no
wonder I didn't read more books this year or last year.
That's no small feat. I'm so proud of you for reading that novel. And it's really the unabridged.
Yeah, but let's be clear that the abridged version is only 400 and some pages, and I did have that, but I was shamed into reading the full unabridged.
Lesser people would read the abridged version, but not you.
No,
you did the full.
I always take the high road on those. Yeah.
Well, let's in the last few minutes we have here, some books that maybe you've already started and are kind of looking forward to reading in the new year.
Yeah, and there's several books, and there's a couple that I started last year that I didn't finish, and I might mention 1 or 2 of those.
Well, I don't want to call you a quitter necessarily.
No, so that's why they're on my desk. I don't intend to quit. It's actually a sickness of mine. For the most part,
that stack just keeps getting higher.
It's got to be bad for me not to finish the whole book, and so I plan to do that. But one that's not a bad book, but it's by Paul David Tripp, Dangerous Calling, writing to pastors, and he has some good things to say in there. What was kind of fascinating about that book, if you are a pastor, is that the original version, at least the one that I bought, there were 5 endorsements by pastors, Christian leaders, saying how important this book was, because being a pastor was a very challenging calling. And what was ironic, of course, about that was that 3 of the pastors who endorsed the book ended up having to leave the ministry themselves after endorsing the book. The only thing, this is the first book I've read by Tripp, and I think he has a lot of great things to say. I'm just not necessarily, I get lost a little bit in his style. I feel like it's a bit repetitive, and he's the kind of guy that he sort of piles up this kind of, it's almost like instead of saying things one way, he'll say it 3 ways, and he's basically saying the same thing, but just in different ways. And I don't know. I wasn't a big fan of that style. It's like, just say it once, keep moving on. With your wife or my wife editing, they would have cut out 2/3 of what that had been me.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's one book. There's a couple other books that I'm into. I haven't finished yet. One is Quiet by Susan Cain. I do plan on finishing this one. It's one of those that kept, not that I wasn't finding it interesting. I just I would have something else more pressing I had to stop and read first. But it's a whole book on introverts, and
I've heard of that
being an introvert. I just felt like it was good to understand it. And boy, she makes a strong case. And I think it's a great read actually for people. I do intend to finish this one. because a lot of times if you're an introvert, you're seen as just not very friendly, or you don't care about people, and it's or you don't have much to say. And she says so many things that we just presume. Extroverts are just immediately seen as more friendly. They may not be any more friendly.
They're just more talkative.
They're more they just like to talk. And so an interesting read. Also, I've just about finished the book by Rodney Stark on the rise of Christianity. And again, I got into that a while ago, and then just had a bunch of other things to read. So that one will also get knocked off here this year. But interesting book about, just from a sociologist's perspective, how Christianity really rose into prominence and grew. A book I'll just confess to you here in the seat of confessional, I've never read from start to finish, but I really want to, is Dietrich Bonhoeffer's The Cost of Discipleship. And he's a German. It's
I can
written
hear
from
the gasps
German
all
into
across the audience.
yeah, scandalous. It's considered such a classic.
Yeah.
And I've underlined tons of stuff in the first third or so of the book. Just, again, one of those books you put down, you put down and then you get swept up in other things. But I know I need to finish that book, and I will. And then there's a book, it's a biography that I also started a little while, not just a month or two ago, but it's by N.T. Wright, who's a New Testament scholar, and it's a biography on the Apostle Paul. And interesting approach. He writes it like a biography, based on Scripture and then just anything else that he can pull into it. But Wright is really considered one of the top New Testament scholars today. He's based at Oxford University right now, but interesting, just trying to look at Paul as a person and what made, what put him together. Sometimes he looms larger than life in the Bible, but trying to just sort of unpack what it would have been like for him in that day.
Yeah.
And maybe just a couple books that I'm going to be getting to. I just actually had a book by Mark Miller sent to me, I think yesterday, called Smart Leadership. It's a brand new book he wrote. I think he had it sent to me. Miller, of course, he's a leadership guru at Chick-fil-A, their headquarters. Has written a number of books on leadership, and so that looks interesting. I'll probably take that with me on my next trip and try to get into that. My problem as I get older is I start delving into about 10 books at once, and then I just dip here and dip there and eventually finish them all. But I used to just plow through one at a time, and I don't know, now I get distracted and just have so many things I'm interested in. I also just picked up recently a book. It's a couple years old, but I finally got one by Brian Jones called The Emperor Domitian. And Domitian was, of course, a Roman emperor, probably around the time of John when he wrote the book of Revelation. And there's a lot of debate about how much persecution of the church did Domitian bring about. I've tried to pick up biographies on a lot of especially the prominent Roman emperors, from Augustus and even Caesar before that, up through to Domitian at least. I've got one on Hadrian and Trajan still to read, and Marcus Aurelius. I've also got one on him I haven't read yet. But I'm kind of curious because a lot of, when you read the book of Revelation, some of the persecutions coming on the church, it's sort of enlightening to see kind of what was going on in Rome at the time.
Right.
And a couple of leadership books that I'd like to get into as well, two that have been out for a couple of years, but I know you've read at least one, maybe both of them. One is by Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow. You read that book, didn't you?
I'd highly recommend it.
And I know it's highly recommended, and I want to get to it. It's kind of a thicker book, it looks like. So I'll probably have to take a run at it.
I would say it's sort of in the vein of, or at least sort of to tackle it, it's kind of like the rise and triumph of the modern self.
Oh, really?
So it's a bit more academic.
Yeah.
So it's dense for sure, but it's really fascinating.
Because I was never that good at science, but a lot of I find it still is helpful for me to kind of plow through some of that, especially the psychology, but also some.
Well,
of the
it's
other
just
stuff.
really interesting, and it's got a lot of application, I think, to leaders.
I think we'll probably unpack that book once I've read it. We can. Another one that I think is maybe a little bit on that category as well as Daniel Levitin, The Organized Mind. And you've listened to that. You've been exposed to that in some way.
I feel like it was probably through a podcast, but I don't think I've I don't think I've read that one.
Yeah,
I think your son
you might
Mike
have suggested it, but it's,
Yeah.
the subtitle is Thinking Straight in the Age of Information Overload. And so the idea
Yeah.
of so much coming at you in so many different directions, but how do you kind of keep your thinking in a straight,
Right.
progression? That looks interesting. And a couple other biographies that I've had for a little while that I'd like to get to. One is on the life of Bismarck, Otto von Bismarck, who basically led Prussia to become the superpower of the German states, and helped Kaiser Wilhelm to become powerful, that led ultimately up to the World War I. I've got a biography on Peter the Great by Robert Massey that looks interesting. And also I've got a biography on Louis XIV I've wanted to read for a while. I think I started that one and then got hijacked at some point by something more pressing. That happens now and then.
Yeah.
Also I had started a while, I think earlier in the year, I started digging in about halfway through The Holiness of God by R.C. Sproul. Sproul died a while back, and it kind of inspired me to read kind of his classic, and I'd like to get back to that, and I'll certainly finish that one as well. So lots and lots of books out there to read. I'm like really a kid in a candy store. When I start looking at all the books I still want to read, and
there's just so many.
If I had a year or two, I could just sit here in my recliner in my office and just read all day long. And, how rich that would be. But we did a podcast recently on just intentionality and focus and being purposeful. And so I kind of like to pull some of these books out, keep them where I see them, as just a reminder, hey, don't just sit there and, kind of kill time on the internet the last hour of the evening. Go turn all that off and pick up a good book and dig in. Or every time I fly somewhere, try to knock off a book if I can. And some are much better at that than I. Some literally read a book a day almost. I don't have that much time, but I certainly feel like I could be maybe a little more intentional to, because I read basically underlining words and sentences and pulling out quotes and summarizing books when I'm done, and because I want to get as much from it as I can to draw upon later. But I guess I just would want to encourage all of our listeners, get your own list. I mean, you don't have to read the books I'm reading, but I just wanted you to kind of hear a little bit about just the process of kind of spreading it around. If you're a leader, always have a book on leadership that you're into. Never hurts to read a biography of a leader, see what they actually did, get inside their mind. And then some Christian discipline like prayer or something else, just to be exposed to something that speaks straight into your Christian life.
Right.
And so much that you could benefit from. There's so many rich materials out there. Have some book that don't ever go on a trip. Don't ever wait to pick someone up at the airport don't go to a doctor's office where you have to wait 45 minutes to see the doctor. Have a book with you and seize the moment, and you might just read something that changes your life.
Yeah. Well, we'd love to hear your our listeners' feedback on this list.
And suggest a book. If you read a book that's just really awesome, let me know. I'll be happy to order it and read it.
Yeah, you can email us, podcast@blackaby.org, or you can reach out to Richard on Twitter. We'd love to get your recommendations and also your thoughts on any of these titles that we've mentioned. And, we may make this an annual thing and just kind of, it's a little bit different, but I thought it'd be fun to just kind of see what's in your current library and what's on your mind. So thanks for walking us through these. And it's going to take
I've got to read these books, and I put myself on the line.
Well,
now.
hopefully you can, I'll be done linking to all these books by the time you finish reading them. So until next time.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.